From 89.7 WUWM, Milwaukee's NPR, this is Lake Effect. I'm Joy Powers. Today we'll explore what it means to be a Democratic Socialist. Then we'll learn about Ko-Thi Dance Company's efforts to raise money after losing federal funding.
If you got a Ko-Thi story, if you've ever heard the drums, if you've ever been moved, if you've ever been touched, if you have ever seen something in Ko-Thi that's inside of you, now is the time to support this thing that is important.
Plus, we'll tell you about a new series called Cinematic Sisterhood that aims to expand the visibility and influence of women in film.
The Women's Fund is working to accelerate transformational change with more significant investments. In this case, it allows us to influence change and the role of women both on the screen and off the screen.
All of that is coming up on Lake Effect. But first, here are today's headlines. This is Lake Effect from 89.7 WUWM, Milwaukee's NPR. I'm Joy Powers, and thank you so much for joining us. Milwaukee has a long history with socialist policies. The Socialists were credited with revolutionizing politics in the city and creating many of the institutions we've come to rely on. But our socialist foundation was very much a thing of the past until politician Ryan Clancy was elected to the Milwaukee County Board of Supervisors in 2020. He became the first socialist politician to be elected to the board since 1956. Now Clancy is a member of the Wisconsin Assembly, where he's joined a small but growing socialist caucus. Representative Clancy was featured in an article in this month's Milwaukee Magazine, and he joins me to talk about socialist priorities and the pushback he's faced during his time in politics. Representative Clancy, thank you so much for being here.
Thanks for having me, Joy. I appreciate it.
How do you describe democratic socialism for those who are unfamiliar with the party and its ideologies?
Yeah, I mean, in its simplest term, it's making sure that everybody has enough and that nobody has a massive excess, right? So democratic socialism looks like everybody having housing, everybody having food, and, maybe nobody having an 18th yacht or vacation home.
To some, that simplification seems to maybe speak to their fears of socialism. It seems you yourself had some trepidation about socialism as a concept. How do you get people to view that differently? Is it with that kind of simple kind of description? Is it by going through the issues and your beliefs on it?
Yeah. I mean, it's really through policy. I think I tend to draw people into socialism by talking about what it actually looks like, not theoretically. And I have very little interest in socialist theory, but in practice. And I think, something like the right to counsel, something that, provides attorneys for people when they're facing eviction. People can see that makes sense. And when you go into it, you can realize that it makes financial sense too. And that, since we instituted that in Milwaukee County a few years ago, we've gotten a $4.60 return on every dollar we've spent doing the right thing and keeping people in their safe and supportive housing. Or you talk about, paid parental leave, another example of socialist policy. That just makes sense. It's the right thing to do to have parents spend time with their kids after they're born. And it's better for the economy. It's better for those families. It's better for the businesses they work for. A lot of the time, it's really terribly expensive and wrong to do the wrong thing.
When you're going through these different issues that are important to the Democratic Socialist Party, do you get pushback from people? Do you hear this kind of, reticence to really engage with that?
Yeah, I mean, I think usually we get that pushback just based on the word socialism. So, I think in more parts of the country, other than Milwaukee and Wisconsin, where we have kind of a long and proud socialist history, socialism, the S word, becomes a derogatory term. And it's applied to everybody from, Joe Biden to Ronald Reagan on his most liberal days, I suppose. And it's not. I mean, I think it's a much easier case to make for people who were from Wisconsin and Milwaukee. In Milwaukee, we've had 3 socialist mayors. Wisconsin has a proud history of socialism. But once you get into what it means, what it looks like, the actual socialist policy that we've enacted in Milwaukee, and the positive effects of that, the pushback tends to fall away. So generally it goes something like, I'm a socialist. And the person says, oh, that must be terrible. Like, when did you start eating babies? And I'll say, no, like, which of my socialist policies don't you like? And we'll go through them and they'll say, well, all those are fine. Those policies actually all make sense, but socialism abstractly is bad. And that's fine. And I think, we can have a conversation about using that term or not. But I think that common sense policy where it's providing for everybody's basic needs just rings true to a lot of people, especially in 2025.
It's been interesting, the kind of national conversation that's been happening about socialism and socialist ideas. Personally, I get annoyed when I hear people say, oh, well, this socialist mayor over here, this socialist governor over here. And you look into this person and you go, they're not a socialist. They're not a democratic socialist. They have a completely different ideology. Do you think it is just that socialism itself has become kind of a dirty word?
Yeah. And I think, part of my work and part of our work as a socialist caucus, and at this point, we have socialists in office at almost every level in Wisconsin. So we have, there's 4 of us in the Wisconsin Assembly. There's a socialist in the Milwaukee County Board. There's a socialist on the school board here in Milwaukee. There's a socialist in the city council now too. So yeah, I mean, it is just kind of a catch-all slur, but it's even more annoying to me because people will apply that to very conservative Democrats sometimes, and I'll be like, no, wait, as an actual socialist, they don't get to claim that mantle because that is something that I'm proud of and something we need to be taking back.
Now, as you mentioned, there are a number of socialists who have been elected throughout Wisconsin in different layers of our government. And one thing I find interesting is you're described, like on Wikipedia and things, as a Democratic Socialist, but also someone who's on the Democratic ticket. Can you explain how that works?
Yeah, I mean, so the Democratic caucus in the state, is much larger than the Socialist caucus, which is essentially within that Democratic caucus. We caucus with the Democrats. We are aligned on most issues. I would say that often it's the 4 of us within the Socialist caucus kind of leading the way in terms of, pushing the envelope a little bit. Rather than just asking for 60% special ed reimbursement. We're the ones out there asking for 90% or 100 and really trying to kind of pull along some of the folks who are a little bit more reticent to take those big leaps. Later this summer, maybe in the fall, we're going to be releasing legislation that will cut everybody's property tax in half, or 51% technically. And stop funding education with property taxes, which has always been incredibly inequitable, right? And we're going to tax the rich and corporations, and they can afford that. That is a much better way to proceed. And, that's the sort of legislation coming from the Socialist Caucus, but which I know we're going to have a lot of support from our Democratic colleagues. So there's a lot that we're aligned on. Sometimes there's some tension there, and I think it's generally helpful and healthy.
Well, speaking to that tension, we're actually talking in relation to an article that was in Milwaukee Magazine. In the article, you were criticized by a fellow politician for supporting their opponent in the election, then, wanting to later work together. Of course, that does seem to be the job of a politician, working with people that you may not fully agree with. How do you deal with that kind of pushback from others on the left, especially when you may not have some of the same core beliefs?
Yeah, no, and that's fair. I do work a lot with folks, both I'd say on the left and Democrats and Republicans. That particular individual is a very conservative with a D after his name. I think we differ frequently on policy. There's a lot of pressure when you're in office to kind of line up behind other people on your team, whether that's Democrat, Republican, and for the big votes and the big issues we do. But somebody who is voting as a conservative, somebody who is voting as a Republican, but who has a D after their name for Democrat is not going to get my support. And I will always back the most capable person for an office and the person that I think best represents the district. And in this case, This individual had a couple of people running against him in successive elections, and I helped them out. And I knew it was an uphill battle, but I think it was a fight worth having because we want to make sure that we have people in office that really reflect the values of the district. And in this case, I thought that the competitors were better. And I realize that that comes with some political risk, but I think we need more people out there that are willing to, not support somebody simply because he's been in office for decades, but because, of their voting record. And I'd rather see somebody out there, voting in line with what their constituents believe.
How do you weigh that kind of, pushback versus unity when it does seem like, the right is very unified often?
Yeah, I think that is, kind of keeping our eyes on the prize makes a lot of sense. And I want to be sure that, especially in 2025, that we're, directing most of our efforts towards pushing back on fascism. And that's not, in 2025, an exaggeration. We also need to make sure that we have other people in office who are willing to do that. We're not going to be voting like Republicans, frankly. And sometimes that requires some change of people in office. And there are political risks to doing that, but I'm always going to back the person I think is best equipped.
What is your hope for the future of democratic socialism? Do you see this as a party that could replace the current Democratic Party, or do you see it continuing to work inside of it?
That's a big debate within, I think, leftist circles, right? And it's, do you do a clean break or do you do a dirty break? And right now, I want to be clear that, Democratic Socialists in Wisconsin are not a party. We are an affiliation, we're a caucus, and I'm very proud, most days, right, to be part of that larger Democratic caucus. But we've seen some movements recently, and we've seen some issues, for instance, around Palestine, where some of the establishment Democrats are trying to push out those of us on the left. And I think when our target should be folks on the right, that's not a good strategy. And I think we end up alienating a lot of folks on the left who would otherwise, join together with Democrats, but are asking themselves at this point, are the Democrats the party for me, or do we have to do something else? So I'm a big fan of big tents. I want to be sure that there's room for everybody, but the tent seems to be getting smaller, and it seems to be putting folks on the left outside of it sometimes. And I think that's worrying. That's not how we're going to continue to win electoral victories.
Sure. Well, Representative Clancy, thank you so much for joining us here on Lake Effect.
Thank you, Joy. Appreciate your time.
Wisconsin Representative Ryan Clancy represents the 19th District here in Milwaukee. He's a member of the Democratic Socialists of America and the Democratic Party. He was featured in this month's Milwaukee Magazine. Ko-Thi Dance Company is an African dance company in Milwaukee. For 56 years, Ko-Thi has been preserving, teaching, and performing dance and music, rooted in the cultures of the African diaspora. But a loss of federal funding could jeopardize the company's ability to continue its work. Ko-Thi is calling on the community to help fill in the gaps through its $56 for 56th fundraising campaign. WUWM's race and ethnicity reporter Taryn Powell is joined by Asha Sawyers, the managing director for Ko-Thi Dance Company, to talk about the funding loss.
Ko-Thi is important, and we have got to fund Ko-Thi. The community that loves and receives from Ko-Thi has now got to start funding Ko-Thi. That's like the overarching thing. Why is that happening? Because our funding from the government has been erased, right? Like this administration has literally decimated 2 major grants for the organization. So that's like the overarching general thing. But there's this other underlying thing, which is that our community has got to learn how to support the things that support us. We have to give to the things that matter to us. And this administration is actually doing us a favor in the sense that we are learning how to keep what somebody else would take away from us. We get this opportunity to choose to keep it. And so that is why we're starting the 56 for 56. We're saying they would erase us by taking away two of these major grants that support our existence, right? They would erase Ko-Thi by doing that. That's why the grants were rescinded. That's why they were taken away. But we've created this campaign to say community. If you got a Ko-Thi story, if you've ever heard the drums, if you've ever been moved, if you've ever been touched, if you have ever seen something in Ko-Thi that's inside of you, now is the time to support this thing that is important. These are our stories. This is our identity. This is something that is true about us, and we need to support those things. And so we created this campaign to say, will you support it, and give you that opportunity to take a stand in this moment. With all that's happening, this is actually an opportunity to take a stand and to choose to save the things that matter to you.
And I think that is something with a lot of federal programs being cut and that affecting a lot of local communities. I think that is pushing people to really lean on communities in a way that we as people kind of fell off from.
I feel that's so true. And even if we talk about that, like just back in the day, so you knew somebody was going to say it in this, so it might as well be me. But back in the day, we had a way of supporting our community that was powerful. And younger generations coming up can look back at the civil rights movement and say, wow, look at that. Look at how they're in the streets. Look at how they're pulling their money. Look at how they are, busing each other in and using transportation together and making food together and watching each other's kids and doing it together as community. Look at that. And then we can stand here in 2025 and look around for that community. And many of us are creating it in unique ways. Ko-Thi is a community like that, where we are pulling people in and loving people and giving the soil to do that. But the mass way that it was done back in the civil rights movement, young people can look at that and be like, what is that? Right? Where is that? And I think Ko-Thi keeps inviting us back into an opportunity to create those kind of communities.
When did the campaign start? Like, what kind of details can you give me right now? I know it's relatively new, but when it started, do you guys have like a timeline?
So we kicked this campaign off at the very beginning of June, and we started it off actually at Locust Street Fest. We did this in partnership with Lush Popcorn, shout out to them, who actually hosted a stage for us. And it was like, come do karaoke and support Ko-Thi as we launched this program of $56 for our 56th year. Our goal in this campaign is to reach $100,000. And so we launched it June 1st at Locust Street Days. It was a lot of fun. We were then at Juneteenth, sitting with WNOV at their booth, hanging out, doing interviews and encouraging people to support what matters in our community, right? And to give these donations. And we're going to be doing this all summer long. We're going to do this until we reach that goal, because we have to close this gap, this hole in our budget that wasn't there before. Not only do we not have the funds, but we've taken actions as if we were going to have the funds and created new costs, right? We've got to fill the hole. Like, that's what we have to do.
What kind of was the notification that you would be losing these funds?
You ain't saying nothing but a word, because if you're going to ask me, I'm going to tell you. No. So the first one is NEA, which stands for National Endowments of the Arts. We had received a grant from them. It had been awarded. It had been slated to actually go out and to be paid. And then we received a letter rescinding that award that we had received. Us and many other organizations all over the nation. This is a federal grant, and many organizations right here in Wisconsin also received that letter. What I want to tell you about that letter is this wording. And so I'm going to read it word for word. If y'all ask, I'm going to tell y'all what they told us, okay? This is what they said. They said the NEA is updating its grant-making policy priorities to focus funding on projects that reflect the nation's rich artistic heritage and creativity as prioritized by the president. Consequently, we are terminating awards that fall outside these priorities. The NEA will now prioritize projects that elevate the nation's HBCUs and historic serving institutions, celebrates the 250th anniversary of American independence, fosters AI competence, empowers houses of worship to serve communities, assists with disaster recovery, fosters skilled trade jobs, makes America healthy again, supports the military and veterans, supports tribal communities, makes the District of Columbia safe and beautiful, and supports the economic development of Asian American communities. Funding is being allocated in a new direction in furtherance of this administration's agenda. Close quote. What is so interesting about that quote is not only are we not in it, but the National Endowment of the Arts money is now being used to beautify the District of Columbia. I mean, I see a slight problem with the way that the National Endowment of the Arts money is now being allocated to help the military. I mean, it's an interesting dynamic here now. And just not even the fact that there's no mention of what we do. Did anybody hear African dance and culture preservation? I didn't hear it at all. But just that arts funding is now being used to celebrate the 250th anniversary of American independence. It's very interesting. So that's one major grant. The other one is also very interesting. Arts Here was a very powerful grant. This is a national grant. It is very competitive. We were one of 2 organizations in the entire state to receive this grant. It's a 6-figure grant. It's called Arts Here, and it was absolutely destroyed by this administration. Absolutely destroyed by this administration. And when they were done, the actual entity that distributes this grant has actually had to close its doors since then. Now, this organization is so big that to affect the NEA and to affect Arts Here is to affect a lot of other little grants, because it's almost like a domino effect. But we were one of 2 organizations in the entire state to receive that grant. It was an honor to be taken into that grant. It was a 2-year grant, and it was designed to not only build our capacity, but to build our learning, to expand what we could do. And to help us cross barriers. So one of the key features of the Arts Here grant was so we could translate our work. We actually have 2 albums that we've cut, and we have multiple trainings that we do, and this grant was going to help us actually go bilingual with that and to reach our brown brothers and sisters and Latino nations. So it's really devastating to see these grants go away.
What would the consequences be for Milwaukee if Ko-Thi is no longer the staple that it has been?
Inside of Ko-Thi has sprung up, it's been rich soil for people to spring up like roots and grow like trees. So to say what would reality be like if Ko-Thi wasn't here is to say what would the earth be like if we took away the soil. It's going to be hard to grow. People in every genre have sprung up out of Ko-Thi. Listen, anybody you see dancing probably has some touchstone to Ko-Thi. You'd be shocked at how many threads of lives run through Ko-Thi, whether they are dancers or whether they're in politics or whether they are opening, amazing businesses or whether they're, vice presidents at local corporations. Why? Because we talked about this soil that gives all the nutrients, gives your power back, gives identity, gives a place to be seen genuinely. Really, people are coming to learn who they are themselves as they step into a Ko-Thi room and let their hair down for the first time and just unfold their wings in what we're doing. And this creates confidence to be who you are in a society that's hostile to you. To be who you are in a world that's difficult to live in, no matter who you are. Black, white, Puerto Rican, and Chinese come in here and do these dances and will leave with confidence and strength to step into who they really are in the world. This is something that we know is true because now there have been studies on it. And so often, like CEOs, vice presidents will send their team to go and do dance, or they'll go have them do poetry classes, or go create something, do something, because confidence is built in the doing. And Ko-Thi is soil. So can you imagine a world without the soil? We got a problem without soil.
Asha Sawyers is the managing director for Ko-Thi Dance Company. She spoke with WUWM's race and ethnicity reporter Taryn Powell. And did you know you can listen to Lake Effect as a podcast? Search for Lake Effect wherever you get your podcasts to download and listen on demand. Later in the show, we'll learn about one of Wisconsin's beloved cryptids. But first, we'll tell you about a new series called Cinematic Sisterhood that aims to expand the visibility and influence of women in film. That's coming up next on Lake Effect on 89.7 WUWM, Milwaukee's NPR. You're listening to Lake Effect on 89.7 WUWM. I'm Joy Powers. For nearly 40 years, the Women's Fund of Greater Milwaukee has been advocating for gender equity in the community. Starting next week, they'll be carrying out this mission through film. The fund is collaborating with Milwaukee Film for a series called Cinematic Sisterhood. Each screening in the series is accompanied by an event with visiting filmmakers and roundtable discussions to help foster connections both in and outside the theater. The first film in the series is a documentary called She Rises Up, showing on July 14th. Ahead of that, Women's Fund Executive Director Lisa Atenito and Milwaukee Film Executive Director Susan Kearns join Lake Effect's Audrey Nowakowski. Kearns begins by explaining what the series is and how the collaboration began.
When I first started at Milwaukee Film, I was working with Ann Reed, the former executive director at Milwaukee Film, and she asked me, "Do you know about the Women's Fund?" And I was like, "Oh, I've heard things here and there." And she was like, "Well, we're putting together a grant proposal." So Ann and I really worked on this together for this special grant opportunity. I was super excited about it. Having worked with the Chicago Feminist Film Festival and my background just working with women's history, women's film history, and the industry, it seemed like a really great fit to be able to highlight the work of women filmmakers and be able to kind of connect the film industry with the Women's Fund in Milwaukee specifically, and thinking about how to build some bridges between communities around the kind of artistic work that women filmmakers are doing, but also that, with the goals of the Women's Fund specifically in Greater Milwaukee.
Absolutely. And Lisa, the Women's Fund of Greater Milwaukee has been around for about 40 years, but have you ventured into cinematic events or partnerships previously? And what do you think makes this a good pairing?
Yes, Audrey. The Women's Fund was launched under the umbrella of what was then the Milwaukee Foundation in the mid-1980s after about 10 years of conversation. So yeah, we're coming up on 40 years. Thank you for acknowledging that. We have had a few dabbles in the film industry. During the 100th anniversary of the 19th Amendment, we did some work in film, just promoting the history of the 19th Amendment and the important role that women play in voting blocks today. But this is by far our most significant grant into the film industry in our history. And it is the first of what we hope will be several years of investment of this size. They won't all necessarily be in film or in entertainment in any way, but really the Women's Fund is working to accelerate transformational change with more significant investments. In this case, it allows us to influence change and the role of women both on the screen and off the screen. So we've given full authority to the Milwaukee Film to make the selection of movies and why they select the movies that are in this series. We were just thrilled to be in partnership to make it come to fruition.
Right, and to get into a little more detail, the Women's Fund made a grant special for Milwaukee Film in order to create this series. So Lisa, can you share a bit more on how funding with a gender lens makes this programming different?
This is a pretty regular conversation that comes up. You can probably imagine that at the Women's Fund. We can give directly, all of us, every individual and every foundation could individually make gifts to the Milwaukee Film or any of our favorite organizations. But it's not always about the money. I mean, it is about the money, right? Because we're talking about grants, we're talking about philanthropy. But I think it's really important to understand that the Women's Fund is always giving with intention. We hope that people support the Women's Fund with their intention of supporting and valuing, demonstrating a commitment to women in our community. But then we, in turn, take that responsibility quite seriously and want to make investments that are with incredible intention, which are well vetted, and really are focused on making change more than just, providing and helping people with a need that they have, but really going much deeper and trying to make a significant change.
And Susan, you touched upon this a little bit, but having experience not just in filmmaking, but as the head of Milwaukee Film, I know one of your long-term goals is more diverse programming. And with this series of Cinematic Sisterhood, what kind of things were you thinking about going into applying for this grant, what the series could be? Just share some of the insights about how you went into this whole series.
Yeah, so I will say that obviously representation, behind the camera is very, very important to me. But one of the things that we were thinking about with this series is how to connect people. So just as Lisa was saying, that it's in terms of thinking about the success of women filmmakers, it is about the money, but it is also about connections and networking and being able to know people outside of your own circles. And so that was something that we wanted to build into the series, is how can we make every film an event? So this first one I think is super exciting because Lisa had the idea to look at Women's Entrepreneurship Week, which happened just a couple of months ago now, and use the first one as sort of a bridge into the series. And that gave us a really good lens to look at, what are the films out there right now that are thinking about women's entrepreneurship specifically? And that's how we arrived at She Rises Up. The director is Maureen Castle-Tusty. She will be here for the screening to talk about the work herself. But we've also assembled this panel of folks and have built networking into the screening event so that women filmmakers can come to experience the film. But also we want women entrepreneurs to come, women artists to come, women from all different walks of life to be able to come and be part of the networking, enjoy the film, and also hear the discussion afterwards, because we think that building these kinds of dynamic spaces is just such an important part of this work, of leveraging the work so that it goes beyond just the four walls of the theater space itself.
And can you share a little bit more about the film She Rises Up? You'll be screening that on July 14th.
Yeah. So I will say, first of all, the film starts at 6 p.m., but the networking starts at 5:30. And the film is really a focus on 3 different women in different parts of the world who are entrepreneurs, but in very different ways. And it's really about their resiliency and how different things have affected their ability to make it as entrepreneurs in their lives or in their areas. So for some, it's thinking of it through a business lens and then having to pivot due to all kinds of reasons, whether it was the pandemic is built in, but also one of the women, her name's Maguette, she's from Senegal. Her goal is to bring this drink from her childhood to the world. She gets into a partnership with somebody, and then they essentially have other ideas. And so it's a real moment for her of understanding what are her values and what did she get into this for and how does she pivot out of that still to success. But it's a very real look at the relationship between capitalism and the local and the global. And another woman is thinking about her family's relationship to women and education and how that even ties into things like menstruation. And so she's thinking about how can her company help in a very specific way. She has a fashion company, by supplying and making sort of a reusable sanitary pad so that more girls can go to school so that they can then go on to have careers, because in her area, girls miss school and get pulled out of school during certain times of the month. So it's really looking at these specific cases and how women are responding to all of these things coming at them in order to achieve success, and really bringing their families and their communities along with them as well.
With some of these themes, there's like inspiration, there's fostering connection, there's learning from people in different parts of the world, but probably have similar journeys to what some of the panelists will be speaking about as local female entrepreneurs in Milwaukee. So with both of your lenses, Susan from Milwaukee Film and Lisa from the Women's Fund, can you share some positives about Milwaukee scene when it comes to supporting women, and where is there room for improvement? And what do you hope that this series can do to help make those connections to lead to more progress?
Yeah, I will start, and then Lisa, hand it over to you. I think there's a lot of progress being made. I think there's a lot of support, both philosophical and financial, but also with just resources in general, different kinds of resources. I think one of the things that we are hoping to help overcome is how siloed people can get. So I know a lot of filmmakers know a lot of other filmmakers, and I know a lot of people who work in marketing know a lot of other people who work in marketing. And everybody needs everybody else. Like marketers need filmmakers, need lawyers, need, people who can do just like an amazing business plan, need all kinds of people, like people who know the people who can source materials. And so breaking down some of those silos, I think, is really helpful. I do feel like there's a lot of support in this community and a lot of people who are like, hey, I know this person. Do you know this person? And trying to build those connections, and then also even uplifting through things like social media. So I find that very exciting. Over to you, Lisa.
Thanks, Susan. I mean, I agree that there is a lot of sharing and introductions. I just had a conversation with a banker last week, and she was talking about how welcome she felt when she migrated to the greater Milwaukee community, and she had people introducing her and holding receptions to introduce her to other women leaders in the community, which is fantastic and wonderful. And I think that, there's a lot of previous works, decades of work that have gotten us to this point of connectivity, especially among women. And I use the word women sort of generically, but at the Women's Fund, we do believe in an inclusive term of women. But I think at the same time, if we look at what does it take to be a successful entrepreneur, it takes capital, it takes talent, it takes ideas, it takes support services, accounting, legal, etc. And I think in some of those categories, women have made tremendous strides. And at the same time, there are huge gaps in the infrastructure of entrepreneurship in Greater Milwaukee. I'm not an expert by any means, so I don't want to come across as someone who says this is the situation. But if you have conversations with entrepreneurs, especially women, they'll tell you stories about how difficult it is and how people are dismissive of their idea, or how they put too many roadblocks in to access capital, or because they're not well known or established and they don't have people out there advocating for them. And so they can't access the services and the capital that are needed. And so I think, to Susan's point, yes, we have a tremendous community here, and there are some fertile grounds that have been put in place to help entrepreneurship, especially by women, but we still have a long way to go.
Just to add to that a little bit, Lisa, hearing you talk, so many of these things are also very relevant to the film. Like the women that we see in the film have exactly these same challenges, from people believing to them to, the access to capital and the feeling that their idea isn't good enough, or that idea isn't going to work. That's something I think is really neat too, and that it does help. It helps people locally know that they're not alone in facing these kinds of challenges.
Yeah, and I think that plays to your point of connectivity, right? So we need to be connected locally in order to feel like we're part of something big. But then also this film allows us to connect to something bigger even than our local community, to the global landscape of entrepreneurship and women trying to do better for themselves and their families through entrepreneurship. So it's a really cool opportunity to see the local community reflected on the big screen, even though none of the stories are from Greater Milwaukee or Wisconsin.
So with the July screening, as you both have mentioned, a big lean on female entrepreneurship, as well as the talkbacks afterwards. For this series, what can you share about what it's going to look like down the road? Because it's outside of July, correct? This is going to be an ongoing event?
Yeah, so our aim right now is to have another event in August, one in September that corresponds with the Dialogues Documentary Film Festival, and then a bigger event in October that has multiple days. And then in January, building off a Women's Fund event that's happening in November on the science of happiness, we plan to end the series with a film about happiness. So we don't want to say too much yet because we're still getting some of the pieces in place. But our goal is really to bring in the directors when we can, which we assume will be, I think, for every screening, because we like having that voice be there to be able to talk about the experience and the industry, and but also building in different types of events that correspond with the film. So again, it's not just the one and done, you come and see the film and then you're like, okay, I liked it or I didn't, but different ways that we can think about engagement, whether it's through the filmmaking practice itself or through the kind of conversation and networking that we're having around this event. So I promise that we will get you as many more details as we can as soon as we can.
Well, looking forward to what more is to come in Cinematic Sisterhood. But for today, Lisa and Susan, thank you so much for sharing more.
Thanks,
thank you for
Zachary.
having us.
Lisa Atenito is the executive director of the Women's Fund of Greater Milwaukee. Susan Kearns is the executive director of Milwaukee Film. They both joined Lake Effect's Audrey Nowakowski to talk about their new series called Cinematic Sisterhood. The first screening of the series is on Monday, July 14th, and you can find more information at WUWM.com. We've got a new season of Bubbler Talk going, and we need some new questions. Submit your questions about the Milwaukee area at WUWM.com. We'll take one more break, and when we come back, we'll learn about the legend of the Rhinelander Hodag. That's next on Lake Effect on 89.7 WUWM. Milwaukee's NPR. This is Lake Effect on 89.7 WUWM. I'm Joy Powers. Do you know the legend of the Rhinelander Hodag? The hideous green beast has become a symbol of pride for the northern Wisconsin city. To learn about the lore of the Hodag, Lake Effect's Grit Nunez spoke with T. Krulos, who wrote about it for Milwaukee Magazine last year. But first, we'll hear an excerpt of folklorist Charles E. Brown's 1935 essay on the Hodag.
Hear ye, gather around if you dare, and hear the wretched tale of the Hodag. The fearful beast lived in the dense swamps of the Rhinelander region. It fed on mud turtles, water snakes, and muskrats, but it did not disdain from human flesh. The ferocious beast had horns on its head, large bulging eyes, terrible horns, and claws. A line of large, sharp spikes ran down the ridge of its back and long tail. The Hodag never laid down. The 7-foot-long and 300-pound beast slept leaning against the trunks of trees, and the only way it could be captured was by cutting deeply into the trunks of its favorite trees. Now, when you find yourself out in Rhinelander, keep your peepers peeled, because you might find yourself encountering the horrendous beast of the Hodag at the dead of night. Now, listen as T. Krulos recounts the origins of this tall tale.
The Hodag is this terrifying beast that lives in the woods of Rhinelander, Wisconsin. And the origin of this dates back to 1893. There was a character named Eugene Shepard, and he was a land surveyor for the lumber companies. So he spent a lot of time hanging out at lumberjack camps, talking to lumberjacks and sharing stories. He comes into town one day, and he has a photograph of what he says is a monster that he saw in the woods and was able to take a picture of. And a lot of people believe him, even though by this point he's sort of gotten a reputation as the town prankster. And if you see this photo, you're kind of like, wow, how would anyone get fooled by this? But you got to remember, this is an era long before CGI or Photoshop or even movies. Movies are just starting to become available, so a lot of people haven't even seen a movie at this point. And a lot of people believe that the camera doesn't lie, and that's true, but the person behind the camera can lie. So it turns out that he had made this monster out of carved wood and some old bull horns, and he made this monster with horns and fangs and a row of spines down its back. And it's to people at the time, it's very believable and frightening.
So kind of like Loch Ness Monster-y?
Yeah, along those lines, it was intentionally a hoax. He was just like, I don't know, bored, wanted attention. And he kept this going for a while. 3 years later, in 1896, he says, I actually caught a hodag. We put a chloroform-soaked rag on a long stick, and we knocked it out, and I captured one. And he actually displayed this at the Oneida County Fair in a tent. It was a dark tent. People would walk in. He had the sculpture in a cage, and then he had an assistant hiding underneath the cage that would move it around and make growling noises.
Whoa.
And people, again, believed this was real. And word got to the Smithsonian Institute, and they're like, oh, a new animal. We're going to go up to Wisconsin and check this out. And that's kind of when the hoax was over. He had to admit he had been fooling everyone. But it's really great because now the hodag has become like the town symbol of Rhinelander. They realized that this would be a good way to draw in tourists and just sort of a symbol of Rhinelander pride. So like the high school football team are called the Hodags. They have a big hodag statue outside of their tourist office, and they have a hodag festival. There's even, and I mentioned this in the article, a hodag store, which specializes in souvenirs and merchandise. So it's just kind of fun that they've really embraced this monster as like their town symbol.
Right. I mean, it seems like Eugene Shepard was all in on this ring. He was really all in. I don't know. I mean, it's such a great story. I can imagine why the city would make it its symbol.
Yeah.
So can you kind of elaborate a little bit on like how else they take pride in it? I know you mentioned the Hodag store was something.
Yeah. And that started off as like kind of a normal antique store, but the proprietor, who I had a chance to talk to, Ben, he said people were coming in all the time asking if he knew where to get hodag souvenirs. And so he started by putting a shelf, and then it was a couple shelves, and then he turned the whole store into a hodag store. And by the way, this monster is supposed to be green. And so he ended up painting the entire store a hodag green color to draw people in. But there's a hodag country music festival. There's also a newer festival called the Hodag Heritage Festival, and that one's more folklore centered. So they'll talk about the hodag and other Wisconsin, ghost stories and legends and stuff like that.
Whoa.
And the great thing about the hodag is it's a uniquely Wisconsin thing. And there's other towns across the country like this. For example, Point Pleasant, West Virginia, has a story of the Mothman. In the 60s, there was a wave of these Mothman sightings, whatever it was. And so they've embraced that as well with a festival and a Mothman museum. So it's very similar to that. And I love it when these towns are like, well, here's something we have going for us, even though it's a little strange. This is something that can draw in tourists. We can have celebrations. So it's just really fun. And especially this time of year, of course.
Absolutely. And I'm also curious, like, how has the look of the hodag changed over the years? You kind of described it like he was kind of a box at the end of the day. And yeah.
Yeah, the original one that Eugene carved, I mean, it looks kind of cool, but it's kind of crude looking. But if you compare that with the Hodag statue that they have now in Rhinelander, it's this very sleek, very well-designed fiberglass statue. But, it's always had the same characteristics, bright green, big fangs, claws, horns, and spikes. So it looks pretty similar.
Yeah, and I'm also curious, you focused on writing about so many different monsters and where they, originate from. What made you specifically want to focus on writing about the Hodag?
Yeah, well, I've loved monster stories since I was a kid. I used to love to watch Godzilla movies, and I was very interested in mythology and folklore and anything to do with monsters, really. So when I was talking to one of my editors at Milwaukee Magazine, I was like, why don't we revisit a classic? The Hodag is just such a great story. The Hodag store was kind of a fresh angle to that.
And have you yourself seen the Hodag in Rhinelander?
Yeah, I was very fortunate. My parents took us on a trip up north and specifically made a stop in Rhinelander because they knew that I would probably like the Hodag story. And they have like a lumberjack museum in Rhinelander. And one thing they have on display there is a replica of the original Hodag that someone carved in a case.
That's
and
neat.
I loved it, of course, and they bought me a Hodag t-shirt, and I was super happy about that.
Oh my gosh, I love it. Okay, well now I want to go, and I will be visiting Rhinelander soon. Well, T, thank you so much for speaking with me today and talking all things Hodag.
Thank you very much.
T. Krulos is a local writer, and he spoke with Lake Effect's Excret Nunez last year. And that wraps up today's show. Thank you so much for being here with us. I'm Joy Powers. If you missed any of Lake Effect this week, you can find all of our conversations at WUWM.com. If you'd like to take the show on the go, you can download the Lake Effect podcast wherever you get your podcasts. Tomorrow on Lake Effect, we'll learn about the work the National Weather Service does in Wisconsin and what the future of forecasting might look like. Thanks so much for joining us right here on listener-supported 89.7 WUWM, Milwaukee's NPR.